webinar on hydropeaking. Before the talk, I'd like to give a brief introduction to the speaker. Anushruti Kurkreja is a doctoral researcher in the Department of Geography and Geosciences at Friedrich Alexander University, Erlangen-Nuremberg. With a background in civil and hydraulic engineering and sustainable water resource management, her work focuses on hydropeaking and its ecohydrological impacts on river systems. Her current doctoral research combines field monitoring, hydrological data analysis, and stakeholder engagement to understand how flexible hydropower operation affects downstream rivers, drawing on case studies from Germany, Italy, and India. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Anushruti to start her presentation. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Avinash, for that kind introduction. I will just share my screen. And thank you to the IAHS working group to invite me for this talk today. My talk will be about sustainable hydropower and hydropeaking, something that my team has been working on for a while in Europe, and then we have slowly started expanding our horizon in India as well. And I would give a certain weightage to the impacts, some of the monitoring challenges that we have faced, and some stakeholder perspectives that I feel might be relevant from our case studies in Europe and India. But before I begin about hydropeaking and the management of hydropeaking, I would like to start with these photographs. At a first glance, you would expect that these were taken at different seasons or different weather conditions, or perhaps under in like different years. And most of us would expect that the river would be driven by some natural processes like rainfall, snow melt, or some seasonal variation. These photographs were taken from our site in Italy at the same location in a span of 10 minutes. So that was quite interesting for us because now we know that these are not primarily driven by natural processes, but they might be linked to some anthropogenic processes, especially the hydropower plant that is located on the upstream of this case study. And depending on who is actually looking at these images, they may tell very different stories. For a hydropower manager who knows that turbine operations are taking place, he may say, okay, this is a flexible hydropower production for me. For a hydrologist like you and I, we will see an altered flow regime. For an ecologist, they would see the changes in the habitat, conditions. And if we were river users on, this site, we would also see some changes in the form of, okay, there is different accessibility to the river now, or, it might impact my fishing criteria, or let's say some recreation opportunities like rafting or bathing or other things like that. So the diversity of, these perspective actually tells us an important challenge at hand, that how we can benefit from hydropower production in a sustainable manner, but also try and manage it in the way where we are able to preserve the river ecosystems. But before that, we would want to understand why actually hydropower matters in the modern energy systems. And yes, it is contributing a significant 14% in the global energy mix, but the number or the amount of energy it provides our energy systems is not the exact reason why hydropower matters. It's also because hydropower provides grid stability by responding very rapidly to the changes in the electricity demand. And that is why it matters so much in our modern electricity systems right now. By flexibility, I mean when we combine it with, let's say, or we compare it with variable or volatile production sources like wind and solar, they are heavily weather condition dependent. So the flexible production that hydropower provides us is that it balances the increasing and decreasing needs of our grid. And in that sense, it will stabilize our grid and give us the demand that we actually require. So from the energy system perspective, this is very beneficial because yes, it provides grid stability. But from the river system perspective, this rapid, shutting on and off of turbines that provides this flexible production can actually translate into fluctuations on the downstream side of our river. And that is where we can link our hydropower systems, the flexibility of them with hydropeaking. So you might be wondering what hydropeaking is. For those of you who have less idea, it's the rapid artificial fluctuation in a river flow, or it could be discharge, it could be water level, and this is basically caused by the flexible hydropower production that we have. And in this example, we see it's from Mezzo Lombardo. It's a site in Italy, which is heavily studied in the hydropeaking research. We see that there is base flow here, and then we have these sharp, rapid peaks that happen in a very short time scale. In a and they have happened several times within a few days. So hydropeaking is essentially the response of these rapid changes in hydropower production that happens very relatively quickly. And if we ask ourselves of how we can actually categorize these hydropeaking events, so if we take a single event, you can see that the cycle contains a sharp increase, followed by a peak flow and then a decrease to the base flow. And the parameters that we analyze would be the changes in the amplitude from the base flow to the peak flow, the change from the base flow to the peak flow, how fast the peak actually takes place, how long does the peak last for, which is the duration of the peak, and then how does the peak go from the peak flow to the base flow. So this is a single hydropeaking event that we are characterizing. After characterizing one hydropeaking signal, how can we characterize the entire time series that we have at hand? We normally look for subdaily fluctuations because they happen in a matter of, let's say, few hours, sometimes few minutes. We look for operational frequencies and periodicities, seasonal changes in the intensity of hydropeaking. So how maybe, let's say, summer fluctuations may change in comparison to winter fluctuations, and certain interactions with environmental variables. Let's say it could be temperature, it could be the dissolved oxygen in the river, and there are many parameters. And what our team does is we analyze it with some very basic tools, like time series analysis, change point analysis, and wavelet analysis. Time series helps us to see the overall variability that we have and the timing of these events. Change point analysis can help us in identifying the shifts in behavior of these signals. And then we have wavelet that will help us to break down the dominant periodicities and how they change in time. But our main topic at hand is not the method that we use for hydropeaking impact today, but for the hydropeaking signals that we have, more so on the impact that it has on the river ecosystems. If you see on the left, we have a very stable environmental flow with a relatively stable hydrograph. And then we have the turbine operations that are taking place at the hydropower plant. And then this is a schematic representation of what can happen on the downstream side, which is also called as hydropeaking, where we see now on the downstream, our river flow has, sort of reflected the turbine operations. that have happened on the upstream. And these impacts could be on different river processes. It could be ecological, it could be hydromorphological, there could be a lot of environmental impacts. And in our case, especially in India, we saw a lot of social impacts as well. Coming to the ecological impacts, there's a lot of literature that talks about the different life cycle disruptions that take place for species, especially in Europe and US and Canada, where there are the timing of reproductions, the emergence, migration that is being impacted because of hydropeaking cycles. There is an impact on the stranding and drift of fishes, invertebrates, early life stage juvenile fishes in particular are highly impacted because of hydropeaking. And then, as we saw in the pictures earlier, also there is repeated wetting and drying of these habitats, so that this creates a habitat instability. And then we have, this translates into the food web dynamics of the river systems as well, because you have altered benthic invertebrates and periphytons and fishes being impacted. So the whole food web sort of gets impacted because of it. And in the long run, we expect some community level filtering also, because you have some taxa which will be more tolerant to disturbance of these because of these hydropeaking signals than other species. And apart from the ecological impacts, there are also hydromorphological impacts that have been observed, where we see alterations in flow regime. There has been enhanced sediment mobilization, altered deposition and scour patterns are observed. There are changes in channel and bed properties that we observe. And something particular that my team is working with is the groundwater surface water interaction and how it is impacted because of hydropeaking. Um, and we've seen changes in the hydraulic, gradients and flow paths. I'm not a groundwater expert, but yes, my team has a lot of experience with groundwater surface water impacts because of hydropeaking. On the right, if you see, there is the river Ezra, which is from Spain. And this is a picture that was taken from 13 kilometers downstream of a hydropower plant. And you can see that within a matter of 10 minutes, the entire river channel has been inundated. And then you have rapid changes in the wetted area and the suspended transport that is associated with hydropeaking. There are also a lot of environmental impacts that have been observed in relation to hydropeaking, where we see changes in turbidity, dissolved oxygen, and something in particular that is interesting is the thermal alteration. So we have thermopeaking cycles. We have the rapid temperature changes in the river water temperature. So when you release amount of water from the turbine, that releases a cold wave into the river, and that can create peaks in a matter of which is sort of mirroring the hydropeaking signals that we observed. Some other literature also points to sound peaking, where there were, subdaily noise and vibration studies that took place because of the turbine operations and spillways. And then there is carbon peaking that is also being extensively studied now. We have discussed the ecological impacts, or we have discussed the hydromorphological impacts and also the environmental impacts. And this is more and more relevant with the literature also that we have so far on hydropeaking. But something that a lot of literature misses, and something that we observed when we started our work in India, were the social impacts that could also be, impacted because of hydropeaking. There is literature in Europe which talks about certain, river users and their safety, which is, at risk because of these rapid changes. It could be users who are bathing, angling, or rafting. and they could be impacted by these short cycles. What also is observed is there is impact on small scale fisheries. Riverbank agriculture can be impacted. There are communities that focus on sand and gravel extraction on the riverbanks. They can also be impacted severely because of hydropeaking. This is particularly relevant to our case study in India because we see that there are communities in around the globe where rivers have cultural and spiritual significance, and then the ritual bathing, seasonal festivals, and the sacred river stretches that are associated with these rivers can be impacted because of hydropeaking. And one particular thing that is interest to me is the governance and equity part of hydropeaking. Who benefits from the energy production versus who is actually bearing the costs? So it could be the upstream energy users versus the downstream communities that are impacted because of hydropeaking, and how they are impacted differently because of the flexible hydropower operations that we have. And often from it has been seen that the people, or the communities that are actually bearing these costs, have very limited participation in decision making, of how they should be operated. This is we have talked about the impact, and now I would like to actually briefly mention this paper that was recently published by Venus and team, and they have talked about the trade-offs of hydropower production, and from the lens of let's say the perspectives of stakeholders that are involved. And the study based was based on the best worst scaling model with 98 hydropower experts and stakeholders from Europe, and they were asked to respond to the the ecosystem services that they feel were most likely and most negatively and positively impacted by hydropeaking. On the left, you can see the different ecosystem categories that were provided. Like they categorized it into three big chunks, with which were provisioning services. It could be power generation, it could be irrigation, drinking water. We have regulation and maintenance services, the form of habitat maintenance, water purification, erosion prevention. And then we have the cultural services, where you have angling, river users in boating, bathing, rafting. So more on the recreational and the social aspect. The part that is most interesting is the right side of the slide, which is the results that they got were that the most positively affected services were, of course, the power generation. That was what we were expecting. Then the raw materials that are used for energy, the water for industrial activities and irrigation. And the most negatively impacted or affected, that in their perception, were the fishes and aquaculture, maintenance of these habitats and populations, and the wild animals. So the key message here is that hydropeaking sort of creates a very scale and value trade-off. So benefits are more likely related to the energy and water use, which are on a regional scale, while most of the costs that are bared are concentrated in the ecological and cultural services, which are more so on the local scale. So this was a very interesting study that we had. I now want to move on to our contrasting case studies. That's something that we have been working on. The first is a long-standing site in Italy, which is the Noce River, and it is a river that has been well researched with hydropeaking, and there are a lot of research groups working on a lot of different elements like like thermopeaking, carbopeaking, the geochemical reactions that can change because of hydropeaking. There are also surface water groundwater interaction studies that are going on there. And then there is the second contrasting study, which is our project in Indian Himalayas, where hydropeaking research is very much emerging, where there are some other research challenges that we face apart from just hydropeaking in general. It was and some stakeholder perspectives from these two case studies is something I would like to discuss. First would be my case study from the Noce River, Italy, which is an alpine river system which is heavily impacted by hydropower operation. And the figure on the left, you can see we have a lot of monitoring, like a strong network of gauging stations, piezometers, hydropower plant on on the downstream of the hydropower plant, which is here, and this site is in the northern part of Italy. And what is interesting here is to observe um, the Noce River, which is on the left, and then the Adige River, which is on the right. The Noche River is showing absolutely no seasonal variability, as opposed to the Adige River, which is you can see you can still see signals of seasonal variability. This is a heavily impacted hydropeaking site, and we have been doing a lot of research here in thermopeaking, groundwater surface water interactions. Last year we did a campaign where we wanted to see the hydrogeochemistry and hydrogeochemical reactions that were impacted because of hydropeaking on these sites. And yes, this is a high resolution monitoring site with open access. So there is a website where you can see the hydro peaks happening live. And that is the extent to which there is monitoring of hydro peaking that is taking place in parts of Europe. We have a lot of collaborations also, and there's a lot of open communication, and people are generally interested in the research on hydropeaking. Let's say we have collaborations with other universities who are also working on hydropeaking. The Geological Survey of Trentino is also very helpful. They've provided us with a lot of piezometer measurements. There's been a lot of data sharing in terms of pumping permits. And then we have modeling collaborations, which we take as inputs for our models as well. And then the local water supply stakeholders are also very supportive in this research, where they provide us with a water level and the electrical conductivity data from their piezometers. And there's always been a very constructive communication when it comes to the topic of hydropeaking when it comes to our European site. And this is also because in Europe we have a lot of detection as well as mitigation strategies in place of hydropeaking, and that's because there is policy and management that is directing this research into this context. We have the EU Water Framework Directive, we have which talks about the good ecological status of rivers, and then it mandates minimum environmental flows to hydropower operators, and there is increasing attention to hydropeaking mitigation in general. For detecting, there one case study that particularly comes to my mind is the Caroli indicators, which detect the magnitude, the frequency, the rate of rise and fall in these hydropeaking signals, and how they have compared it across different river systems in Europe, and um, how they have observed that there are rivers that can deviate from their natural flow conditions because of flexible hydropower. And then in the mitigation, one particular study that comes to mind is the Morera et al. And the team that did a very extensive ecological based mitigation, review, where they talked about how we can restrict our ramping rates, how we need minimum flow requirements, what kind of flow requirements we need in different case studies across Europe, what should be the time of releases, which could actually be helpful for sensitive life stages of fishes, of macroinvertebrates, and then some structural measures that could also come in place, like detention basins and morphological habitat improvements, what we could do about it. So in all, what we've observed is that in Europe, there is a lot of work that is going on, and we are actually moving from just detection of hydropeaking to mitigation and management of these hydropower resources. Um, what what lacks in other parts of the world, especially if you see, because the problem is if you see the global overview of the hydropower, plants that are present across the globe, you see that there is a heavy share in Europe, but there's also a very heavy, a heavy share in South Asia. And on the right, if you see, there is absolutely very little literature that talks about hydropeaking or that links hydropeaking and hydropower operations impacts to river ecosystems. And it's very important to understand hydropeaking in other parts of the world also, and this is where our case study in India actually comes into the picture. This is why we decided to move to India. And that's also because of how important hydropower is in the context of India, because it plays a role currently as well as in the future. There are a lot of projects currently in operation as well as in pipeline. And we can, on the left, if you see, there is a very heavy concentration of hydropower projects throughout India, but especially if you see uh, in the Indian Himalayas, which is a very heavily ecologically sensitive zone. And on the right, if you see, there are different hydropower plants. There's storage, run of the river, pump storage. What is particularly interesting is the share of pump storage that is in pipeline, which is almost 50%. And this matters for hydropeaking research because most of the storage, pondage, and pump storage plants are likely to support flexible energy generation. And as India expands expands its hydropower systems for energy security, it becomes very important to know and to ask how this might impact, the different ecosystems and the local water users we have and the flow regimes that take place. But before I actually come to our site, there's one thing that I want to briefly highlight is one of the challenges, the biggest challenges that we faced in India while we tried to start or initiate the talk of hydropeaking there was the data itself. So data was a very big issue. The availability of it was very heterogeneous. So different hydropower projects were having different sort of data, and more often than not, they were inconsistent in their units. Also, most of the monitoring that takes place was manual. So, and it focused more on the reservoir inflow or the storage of the reservoir rather than the response on the downstream. So, we found very limited, or mostly, we found that the gauges on the downstream were more or less absent. So, there were very less monitoring of the river ecosystems on the downstream. And most of the public hydrological records that are available were at daily frequency, which mainly smooths out the sub-daily hydropeaking signals that we were looking for. And even if we had some hourly data, it was quite seasonal. It was more focused on the monsoons times, and it was not consistently archived in their public records. Coming to, given these data challenges, we decided to work with one site in the Indian Himalayas as our case study. It was relevant also because it was a medium-sized hydropower plant, and it was, let's say, in the Indian Himalayas. So it gave us that, the study could be very relevant to ecological sensitivity on the downstream as well. We have actually installed a gauging station on the downstream of the hydropower plant. It is around 800 meters. And it records water level changes and the temperature changes at a resolution of 15 minutes. So this was one of the challenges that we actually had to pass, the hurdle that we had to pass through to start our hydropeaking research in India. Mm, what I want you to see here is how different, the visible hydropeaking cycle could be in this case study that we have. This is our site in India, where you can see that there is heavy inundation, and then there is, a lot of habitat that is changing. Let's say the sediment wetted perimeter that is changing because of the hydropeaking cycles that we that I will discuss later on. And this is the issue that we have, that even though you can visibly see hydropeaking taking place, hydropeaking has not been an active discussion in the Indian research context. Uh, this is a broader picture of how we actually started our work in India, because we had daily signals and we tried to see the variability that we could find in the energy generation. And we saw that, at least in this particular hydropower plant, it was mostly monsoon driven. And also because the cycle was in the daily scale, we could not capture a lot of sub-daily signals here. But you can see that most of the generation is concentrated in the monsoon season. But there is also some amount of generation and outflow of the reservoir that is happening in the low flow periods also. That was particularly of interest to us. Since we had very limited data in the beginning, we started with a certain simple model. So we had some inflow data and some hypsometric curves that we used to see what kind of reservoir outflow we might be able to see. And even though it is heavily concentrated in the monsoon cycle, we can still see that in this hourly reservoir outflow, there is heavy, let's say, variation even in the non-monsoon periods, which was interesting because this was the low flow period of the river. Now we have, so the site is relatively new because we started gauging somewhere mid-November, and we are already able to see the hydropeaking signals, at least in the low flow periods. And you can see that there is almost a jump of 1.4 meters, and this happens on a periodic basis in the entire week uh, that we see. And this also is interesting because this tells us how important sub-daily monitoring is, for hydropeaking research, and how our daily signals might miss these variabilities. We're actually excited to see some monsoon variability. So let's see how the precipitation cycle modifies our hydropeaking signals in the upcoming monsoon that we have. This is just a very brief introduction into the preliminary analysis that we did with the wavelet analysis, where you can see there are daily signals that we see in our case study, but also there are sub-daily signals that our wavelets are already able to capture, um, which would have been smooth, which were kind of like getting smoothed out when we were working with daily data sets. One particular thing that was very interesting with my field survey and the field interactions I had with local communities when we were going on site was the cultural relevance that these rivers have for the local users on the downstream. So we decided we to see, I mean, this is not an exhaustive map, but we decided to scale and see some major holy rivers and some major cultural cities that were exactly on the downstream of, major operational and in pipeline hydropower plants. And we classified them with, if there was some ritual bathing culture, cultural reference, or some cremation funeral pyres that were extremely important on the banks, or if there were some river worships that were taking place and some idol worship that also happens in India, and how this could impact, the local communities and the overall, public gatherings that people have in India. Some of the stakeholders that we were in touch with and the perspectives that we got from them was quite surprising, because if we spoke to the dam engineers and the authorities, they focused mainly on the hydropower generation, and the downstream ecological impacts and hydropeaking were never central themes. For the local communities, they reported to us that they have found reduced fish availability since the operation of the hydropower plant, and researchers that we spoke to have talked about the changes in the river morphology ever since the project has come into place. And then we had a lot of support from local residents to help us secure locations for our gauging station. Some of the field observations that I personally saw were that the residual or the diverted river channel between the hydropower plant and the dam that they have, which is at a stretch of 3 kilometers, was almost dry despite environmental flow requirements, which raises certain questions about how implementation and downstream monitoring becomes even more important in these kind of scenarios. From the observations of the locals. So one thing that we understood was that the locals do not know the term hydropeaking, of course, because they are not very well versed with the technical words. But they did know that, okay, there is the phenomena of hydropeaking because every afternoon they used to see a rise in the water level, and then they used to see a fall in the water level around sunset. And there are certain warning systems, like the signage that we have on the left. This is taken from the hydropower, this is near the hydropower plant, where they warn the local communities to stay away from the banks, and because the water level can rise and fall at any times. But when we discussed with the locals, we came to know that the alerts were not very timely and they were not very consistent. Um, and what we see is that even though the communities may not use the term of hydropeaking, but they recognize the timing, the risk, and the impacts through direct, visual evidence that they had. So what we actually learn from these different contexts is that when it comes to Europe, or let's say the site in Italy, it's well established. There are strong collaborations with local institutions, and indicators and mitigations are possible because, yes, there is a lot of research that has taken place as opposed to an emerging economy like India, where we still have hydropeaking, which is not very spoken about, and there are a lot of data limitations and monitoring gaps that we saw. And local communities can already observe the risk, but at the policy or the management level, people are unaware about, the impacts of hydropeaking. So the key takeaway I would say is that for sustainable hydropower management, of course, we require high frequency monitoring, but we also require a lot of stakeholder engagement, and we also need better communication between the different users we have for energy, for water, and for different ecosystem perspectives. And thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Anushruti. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'll open the stage to the participants. If anybody have any question, they can unmute themselves or they can write in the chat.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Anushruti. So nice presentation, and I would like to share all the audience one of my own field work that we have done actually recently. So I am much miles away from the field of hydropower, but definitely what social context you have shared here, so that actually is very much relevant in different rivers of India, particularly the areas where people are actually totally dependent on agriculture. So in that case, I would like to mention a river called Sunai River, which is actually a tributary of Barak River, and the river has a dam situated on the upstream in the Mizoram state. I actually have to see the name of the dam, which is located in the upstream of the river. Now, after the construction of the dam, from the last few seasons, actually, the river has totally, I can say you that the environmental flow that you have mentioned, or I can say that the uh, amount of water, adequate amount of river water that was needed for local agriculture or say drinking water purpose has been impacted heavily. And I got to know from the people that they depend on the river for their drinking water source, as well as their riparian cultivation, different type of vegetables that also got affected due to the lack of river water. And I can, if possible, I will try to connect with you over Google Meet again, so I can show you the picture. So the river water level was, it was something like that. I guess even less than 1 meter. You can imagine the level of impact of the dam that was created on the upstream. So I believe that there needs to be much more scientific collaborations between governments, startups, as well as researchers, so that impact of the dam can be forecasted before creating the or establishing the dam, so that there is a win-win situation for the upstream people as well as the downstream people, and so that it does not create rift between different states, or I would say even in international cases some disputes are there. I think I can mention Egypt and most probably one African country I forgot. So Egypt and that country has a dispute over the Nile River due to this similar situation. So this can happen at even at a local scale between different states and different districts also. So I guess there is much more need of scientific collaborations between government departments as well as the startups as well as the researchers, so that the pros and cons of this type of projects can be evaluated initially, so that the best possible design or best possible decision can be taken in a better way.
I completely agree with that. That is something that we observed in our field surveys in India also, that there is a there is, like you said, the upstream users and the downstream users are differently impacted, and we need to find like a win-win situation, or like a good compromise, let's say, between the two, so that in the future, these impacts can be let's say attenuated, or mitigated in a
Yeah,
better
yeah,
manner.
yeah, definitely, definitely.
Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Saraswati, and thanks, Avinash.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you
a
so
lot.
much, Adarij.
Feel free to unmute or you can write in the chat. In the meantime, like Anushruti, I have a very broad question. I mean, so how do you think this the sustainability of the hydropower dams with the climate change? There will be, I mean, expecting the extremes would be rise much more, and how it will be going to affect. And you already mentioned like the thing for a better management, we need to have a strong stakeholder engagement. Um, so is that the only possibility for a sustainable hydropower generation? Yeah.
uh No, actually, what I feel is that we can, because there are like mandates for environmental impact assessments in India, right? So the idea would be to include more and more the downstream monitoring into these impact studies also. Like, when you're doing these assessments, or you have regular monitoring cycles where you can actually involve not just dam stakeholders, but also researchers, or local stakeholders, and discuss with them what could be done in those kind of scenarios. Answering your climate question, I actually, there are studies which talk about how there are certain rivers which will have higher flow, at least in India, and that there are certain hydropower projects that will be positively impacted because of the higher inflows that we are expecting because of the climate change. But at the same time, yes, they are positively impacting the inflow and the reservoir and the capacity and how we can produce more energy. But that also brings me to my challenge, right? That there is requirement of more and more monitor. At least in the case of India, what I feel is that basic monitoring and certain environmental flow restrictions, that could be a decent start uh, for let's say, to study the impacts. I mean, because I mean there's a lot of work that is left. I feel that in the form in Europe you have more studies which are focused on certain type of species, certain macroinvertebrates, and how they are impacted because of hydropeaking, as opposed to India, where we are still heavily in the early stages of hydropeaking research. But a good start would be to monitor and to, let's say, bring about the e-flow mandates at least. That could be a good start.
Yeah, hi, Anusruti. I would like to share you a few more observations from our last 6 months. So the data scarcity is really a challenge, and I would be very sad to say you that even the reputed organizations don't have the data here, at least in Northeast India. And we have seen that we don't have even proper rainfall data, and that was quite surprising because our entire Northeast, particularly the Barak Valley part of Assam and some other regions, are heavily flood affected. And here, you cannot imagine to find even a good source of rainfall data, and this has actually created a lot of challenges for us because we could not generate rainfall runoff estimates properly, and that actually impacted us. And even the discharge river discharge data is also not available. So I am connected with few Italian professors as well as some other countries from Europe. So I guess whatever you are saying, that data scarcity is a big challenge for Indian researchers, or I can say Indian policy makers. So I think we have enough materials or enough research done in other parts of world, particularly in Europe, to learn and replicate all those ideas. And maybe I feel that it is high time that Indian researchers or Indian startups collaborate with European researchers and European startups, and everyone, because science cannot be bounded in one country. Science should flow. The blessings of science should flow everywhere. So I guess this is high time, because what you are saying, I can totally relate with my projects, because without data, even one step moving forward is also a big challenge. So I can definitely relate your words to my current situation. Anyways, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Adrish, for those insights. What we observed in India was the issue of public data sets not always being available, especially in the Himalayan and the northeastern regions where data is said to be geopolitically sensitive, and yeah, that also raises a question of whether we need more and more open access data in India and how we can make it or archive it in a way where we can provide it to the researchers that would like to actually study these impacts. Another thing which I feel is that because India is still heavily reliant on manual gauging, it would be interesting and it would be nice to see how we move from manual gauging to automated gauging in the future, because that would also help us with the data scarcity issues that we have.
Yeah, definitely, Anusruti. What you were telling, I can totally support your comment, because here, even the government departments that I have discussed with or collaborated, or we had a lot of meetings, so they themselves don't have the proper infrastructure, and they confessed it. They confessed that they need the improvements and all these things. They need budgets from the grants from the government. So they themselves highlighted the issue of data scarcity. And I think means if we are able to create more weather monitoring stations and river discharge gauge stations at different parts of the flood affected areas, I guess this will create a very good database. And maybe it will be really hard to replicate the past flood records, say rainfall runoff translation or something. But at least what we have missed, that is fine, but at least we can do better now. If we think in a scientific ways, I think it is the high time that we should be at least, we should be thinking in a local level, at a district level, or at a 2 3 districts regional level, so that the installation of the weather sensors, or particularly the river discharge gauge stations, these are installed in proper locations, and these create good database not only for the local policy makers but also for the researchers who are doing work. Maybe somebody from Europe or any other country is interested in India rivers, he or she also can collaborate and work.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Adrij and Anushruti for nice remarks and interaction and lot of topics go back to our first decade of IAHS of this ungauged basins. Yeah. And maybe last question, anybody? Okay, if there is no question, I think we can call it a day. But you can always write to Anushruti or us if you have any discussions or comments, and we are looking forward to it. So thank you all. Yeah,
Thank you so much, Avinish and the IHS team.
yeah. Bye bye.
Thank you everyone,
Thank
thank you
Bye.
Avinash.
you. Thank you
Thank
for your
you.
Thank you
presentation.
Anushruti.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.